In this lesson, we're going to be pulling in our Photoshop document into After Effects and creating the first clip for our project. So let's go ahead and we'll double click in our project panel and pull in our skater at raw. And you can see that we have in our reference files, we have the JPEG and the Photoshop document. Make sure that we pull in the Photoshop document. We're going to pull that in as a composition retaining the layer styles. And when we hit import, then for some reason we also get another option to select a composition retaining layer sizes, and then we're going to make sure that that is editable layer styles and hit OK. And you can see in your project panel that we have the Photoshop document is now being displayed as a composition. And when we open up this folder, you can see all of our layers for that Photoshop file. Let's just double click on the comp, and that will open that up in our project. And let's make sure that our composition is 3 seconds long. And so you can right click on this tab, go to composition settings, and let's make sure that that is 24 frames a second and change that if it's not. And then for our duration, let's make sure that that is set to 3 seconds because we're going to have a 9-second clip. We're going to combine these 3 little clips to make just one larger one, and we're going to hit OK. Let's get started by clipping or grabbing our layer for our skater. And you know that you have that layer selected because you'll see the layer controls around him. But now that we have him selected, let's go ahead and name that layer. We'll just hit enter on the keyboard, and we're going to call that our skater 1. And then the layer 2, we didn't rename that one, but let's go ahead and hit enter on the keyboard, and we'll call that the screen because that is the screen image of him in the background on that monitor. Let's go back to our skater 1, and we're going to start out by using our puppet pen tool. So let's select the puppet pen, and we're going to just click. We'll start right here on his face. We'll just click right there, and let's make sure that in your settings for your puppet pen that you have the mesh on, so you have that show the mesh selected so that we can just see what's happening. So let's zoom in a little bit, and for our expansion we have that set to 3. And we have about 350 triangles. And I don't think that we'll need to adjust the triangles at all. So you can use these settings for your mesh. But let's take a look at, if you're not familiar with the puppet pen, at really how this works. So we just place this first pin. And when we place that pin, then we can move him around however we want, just by using that pin. I'm just going to control Z that. And if I place another pin, so if I had a pin, let's say right here, then when I move his head, then he's pivoting. I am able to scrunch him around a little bit, but that's not exactly the look that I'm going for. I want to be able to move his arm. So I'm going to place a pin right here and a pin on his wrist. And that way I can move his arm around a little bit. And I want to be able to take the bottom half and to be able to kind of create an illusion that he's like, his waist is kind of bending a little bit. So I'll put a pin about right here, and I want to make sure that when I change this pin around that he's not distorting the rest of his body. And there's a way that we can do this. We can grab our starch. And when we use our starch tool, then you are locking down that mesh in certain areas. So you're essentially creating some starch so that it's not distorting. And I definitely don't want his head to distort at all. So I'm going to place a few starch pins in there. And I want to make sure though that I'm still getting some movement for his hand. So I'm going to grab his hand and move that around so I can still move that. Now let's take a look at his waist. And that is pretty much exactly what I wanted to do. I'm not wanting to make his head deformed or anything. So now that I have him all pinned, then I can focus on creating some keyframes for those pins. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull his skateboard up just a little bit, but not so much that I'm getting it all deformed like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click it and just bring it up just a little. So I'm able to kind of create a little bit of a bend here in his torso. And then I'm going to take his hand and I'm going to bring that down just a little bit. It's almost like he's kind of straightened it out. So you can see that those movements weren't that major, but you'll be able to really notice when I move down to the very end of the timeline and then I pull that pin back out. So I'll straighten his body back out, and then I'll raise his hand back up, about like that. So almost to the original position, maybe even a little bit higher, but not so much that we're getting a crazy curve. We still want to make sure that this looks believable. So now when we move back down in our timeline, then you can see that we have that movement. And if you want to take a RAM preview of that, you can just hit 0 on your keyboard. So you can see I'm just barely kind of making a move. Now, another thing that we can do to make this believable, let's zoom out just a little. We're going to select that layer. We're going to hit P and then hold Shift and hit R. And that will pull up our position and rotation. Now let's take our indicator and we're going to put that to the very end of our timeline, and we're going to create some keyframes. And let's make sure that we have our selection tool, and we're going to just take our skateboarder and we're going to put him, just nudge him up just a little bit more, and so that he is just a little bit up and left of his original position. Then we're going to go back to the beginning of our timeline, and we're going to move him back down just a little, and then we're going to rotate him. Let's rotate him maybe about, how about 8 degrees? We'll take a look at that. And so then when we move forward, then we have our skateboarder is kind of like raising his hand, like he's kind of finished out the trick, and you can see like his body is raising up. And so when we combine that rotation with the rotation of his body, then we're able to make it look like that the skateboard is still staying about level and he's just kind of like raising up. So very realistic. Awesome. So now that we have our skateboarder animated, then we're going to just add a little bit to our screen. Let's go ahead and we'll go to the very beginning of our timeline, and let's hit P and then hit Shift and hold that Shift and hit R. We're going to add a little bit of position and rotation for our screen as well. We'll create those 2 keyframes, so hit those little stopwatches. Then we're going to come down to the end, and let's zoom in here because we want to make sure that we're getting this right. And so we want to rotate our skateboarder and just move him a little. So we're just going to nudge him just a little bit, and we're going to rotate our skateboarder. So I've rotated him about 10 degrees. And we'll back up and see if this looks right. We can just hit 0 on our keyboard to kind of get a RAM preview. So that looks about right. Awesome. So we just wanted to make sure that this wasn't static back here in the background. So now that we have our skateboarder doing his trick, we're going to stop here. In our next lesson, we're going to be adding some camera flashes to the crowd, and we're going to be adding just a little bit of a camera pan just to finish off this look.